Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 2. The Atlantic. Scylla lights up the entertainment business. August 25, 2021. Singer and actress Scylla Ramshorn is putting her name in lights and burning down the competition with her newest song, Burning Witches. She easily earned the award for Best Actress for her role in Camarilla at the Critic Choice Awards in April, and now she's hoping to add a Screen Actors Guild Award to her trophy wall this January. Scylla, who started her career in her early teens with folk music and quiet love ballads, soared to popularity when she changed her style with the unexpected hit Sexy, Naughty, Bitchy Me. Those wanting to see the bewitching musician sooner than the award season can catch her at one of the local clubs in Massachusetts as she does a hometown tour in September with a special All Hallows Eve benefit concert for orphan children at Fort Salem in October. For complete details of her show schedule, see her status page at Swithe Records and go to our events page. Rael pulled her pearl-white Subaru Outback to a stop in front of the massive wrought iron gate. It was elegant, but clearly old, and its decorative design would be easy to scale. Taking in the limestone walls that wrapped around the property, her eyes paused on the vines and flowering plants that clung to them. She followed the winding path the greenery made all the way to the top of the wall, and she was disappointed. The vines were also an easy entry point. She put her window down and stuck her head out, looking this way and that, but she couldn't see any signs of camera equipment. Finally, Rael turned her head and scrutinized the call box. Perched atop a rusted pole, it looked like something procured from the 1990s rummage sale. She sighed as she reached a hand out to press the yellowed button with a long, slender finger. The squelch it emitted from the box made her teeth ache. For a moment, Rael only heard static, and she started to wonder if the call box even worked when a teeny, mechanical voice came through the speaker. Yes? So it did work. Rael called her to see Isadora. The speaker buzzed and crackled with static. What? Rael repeated herself, trying to speak as slow and as clear as she possibly could. Who? Rael drummed her fingers on the steering wheel for a moment and then tried a different tactic. Virginia Woolf to see Miss Ramshorn. The speaker must be static again, and Rael could just make out, an appointment? Yeah, Rachel Meadow doesn't look a day over 45, Rael answered. A moment later, the gate groaned open to admit her, and Rael scoffed in disbelief. She drove her car up the curving drive to the front of the main building. She parked and took in the impressive white limestone mansion. It was a beautiful home, but everywhere she looked she could see various vines and greenery. There were flowers and shrubs everywhere, and the place looked in danger of being totally overrun by flora. There were multiple places someone could lay in wait and hide, and it didn't take Rael long to lose count of all of them. The sound of easy laughter caught her attention, and Rael looked over to the other side of the drive to see a tall woman with brown hair styled in a faux masculine cut, chatting with a young man beside a brand new limousine. Even from her car she could see the seat protector still on the limo's leather upholstery. It looked like Isadora had at least followed one piece of Rael's free advice from their several phone calls, and was going to stop using rental companies for limo service. It was the first encouraging sign that she had seen since she had arrived on the property. Raelle stepped out of her car, tugging at her navy blazer to make sure her holstered weapon wasn't making any telltale bulges. She glanced down at her white linen blouse, smoothing away wrinkles that weren't there. She ran her hands down her dark jeans and tried to mentally prepare herself for the meeting to come. As Raelle closed the door to the Subaru and locked it, Brunette looked up at the noise. Her gaze landed on Raelle and she raised her hand, indicating for Raelle to give her a minute. Raelle nodded her understanding and leaned against the side of her car, arms folded. Brunette finished her conversation and Raelle watched as the men got into the limo and drove it around to the side of the home. The brunette sauntered up to Raelle, a seductive grin on her face. "Something I can do for you?" Raelle had to crane her neck to meet the other woman's gaze. She was standing close enough for Raelle to count every freckle that dotted her face. Non-posed, Raelle asked, "Were you the one working the intercom?" "No, I'm Helen Graves," the woman replied, as if that should mean something. "Need some help, darling?" "Jane Addams to see Miss Ramshorn," Raelle said, still testing the security measures in place and watching the brunette closely for any signs of concern. "Uh-huh," the brunette replied, no longer smiling. "And that was arranged by—" "Isadora," Raelle supplied. Immediately, any sense of doubt or alarm left the brunette's face, and her lazy grin returned. "Oh, okay then. Go on up to the door and Mr. Parker can show you the way." Raelle thanked the brunette and headed to the door, adding another concern to her growing mental list. She found the large oak door open. She considered just walking in, but her southern upbringing had taught her better manners than that, and she rang the bell on the wall beside the doorway. She stood there for several minutes and started to think she was going to have to walk inside without the welcome after all. When she was finally greeted by an elderly man with snow-white hair and kind hazel eyes. He wore a simple pale pink polo shirt and khakis. He was using a cane, and Raelle's now understood why the man had took so long to arrive. She almost felt bad for making him come to the door. "May I help you, miss?" the man wheezed. "Are you Mr. Parker?" Raelle asked, offering the old guy a smile. "Yes," he answered simply, still catching his breath. "Great. Miss Graves said you could help me find Isadora. We have an appointment." Mr. Parker furrowed his white brows and frowned. "I'm not sure Isadora is here today." Raelle bit her lip and waited. The gentleman stared at her for a moment and then shrugged. "Well, if you have an appointment, she must be around here somewhere. What did you say your name was?" Mr. Parker asked, leaning forward on his cane, trying to get a closer look at the blonde. "Ann Lister," Raelle replied, "and I had an appointment with Isadora to meet Miss Ramshorn at 3. "Ah," Mr. Parker answered. "Well, come on in, out of the heat, and I'll try to find her for you." Raelle followed the older man as he slowly led her into what looked like a parlor of some kind. He indicated that she should take a seat on one of the sofas and wait for him. Raelle did as he asked, noticing that the furniture was elegant but dated. It matched everything else about the home. The furniture, the rugs, and the decor all looked like it was at least 10 years old. She watched Mr. Parker shuffle away, his shoulders slumping. She waited a full minute after he was out of sight, then stood and walked back into the hall. She turned in the opposite direction that Mr. Parker had gone and started walking through the mansion. The faint sound of music drew her attention, and she followed the sound down the hall and past several closed doors. She eventually found herself at the doorway to a large open ballroom. As she stepped inside, she could see that every corner of the room was full of equipment. There were cameras and lights, various types of technical equipment, and tons of people working with cables and clothes, and other things that made no sense to Raelle. The music was coming from large speakers mounted on poles set around what appeared to be a dance floor. Through the spaces between the people standing and watching, she could see that there were dancers practicing some sort of routine. As the music thumped, their bodies swayed. At last, a man off of her left yelled "cut," and the music and dancers came to a stop. Everyone started clapping, and then grouped together, talking to one another about costumes, lighting, and positioning. Raelle caught sight of Isadora standing off to one side of the room, near a minibar, and raised her hand in a small wave. Isadora saw her and smiled, walking over to the blonde. She offered her hand, and Rael shook it. "I'm so glad you came. I was beginning to worry you changed your mind." "I almost did," Rael admitted. "But I promised I'd at least meet Miss Ramshorn and give her an assessment. What is all this?" "It's a rehearsal for Scylla's new music video." "Oh," Rael answered, surprised. "I'll go get her for you." Before Rael could respond, the older woman rushed off toward a set of leather chairs positioned near several video cameras aimed at the dance floor. Rael could see Isadora talking to a woman with dark brown shoulder-length hair sitting in one of the chairs. She couldn't tell much from the back of the woman's head, but she assumed it must be Miss Ramshorn. Standing there surrounded by people bustling about, Rael felt totally out of place. "What the hell am I doing here?" she thought, twisting the ring on her index finger. All around her, women and men milled about in various stages of undress. Some wore sequined costumes, some walked around in their underwear, and others had the decency to at least cover themselves with robes while they waited for their costume change. None of them seemed to have a care in the world. The only people who looked halfway normal, sporting jeans and t-shirts, seemed to have headsets and were working with equipment. Unfortunately, Rael doubted that they were included in what Isadora had meant by Scylla's crew. After nearly being knocked over by a man carrying some stage settings that looked like a large wooden landscaping pole, Rael moved over a bit closer to the side of the dance floor near the camera equipment. She could see that Isadora was still standing by the chair, talking and waving her hands as people kept interrupting her to talk to the brunette. It was clear that Miss Ramshorn was more interested in the rehearsal than in their appointment. Rael wondered why in the world Miss Ramshorn would schedule an interview for a bodyguard to coincide with rehearsing a music video, but her train of thought was interrupted by the sight of said musician as Scylla finally stood and turned to face Rael. Rael's breath caught at her first proper look at the musician in person. She wore a burgundy silk blouse with several buttons undone, offering a glimpse of what lay beneath the fabric tucked into a pair of black slacks. A gold-toned belt buckle caught the stage light and winked at Rael. She swallowed and forced her eyes to meet the brunette's exasperated gaze. Her first thought was that Scylla's eyes were really as blue as they had appeared on her iPad the night before. The image hadn't been digitally altered at all. Scylla's eyes were like magnets. As the brunette continued to look at her, hands on her hips, a small smirk gracing her soft, full lips, Rael's pale blue eyes were mesmerized by cerulean ones. Rael's second thought was, "Get it together, caller." Isadora looked back and forth between the two women and was all grins at having succeeded in finally getting them together in the same room. She almost sighed with relief as she made the introductions. "Scylla, this is Rael Caller." "Who?" Scylla asked, letting her eyes taking the sight of the obviously out-of-place blonde standing in the middle of the dancers, technicians, makeup artists, and costume designers. She was slender and undeniably attractive. She took note of the blonde's hair with braids on the one side and loose waves down to her neck on the other. Scylla assumed that there must be some special meaning to the style, but she had no idea what it might be. She had pale blue eyes like a glazier. Scylla briefly wondered what was hidden beneath the depths. Surely this girl was new. Scylla would have remembered her otherwise. Maybe she's one of the new dancing talents her casting manager Corey was always trying to hire. He certainly had an eye for rare beauty. Scylla's simple question broke the spell that she had on Rael, and the blonde tore her gaze away from Scylla and quirked an eyebrow at Isadora, whose smile was beginning to falter. "The bodyguard," Isadora explained. Scylla's brows furrowed in confusion, and she didn't attempt to hide her scrutiny of the blonde. Was this really the tough ex-military security expert that her manager had been harping about her hiring every chance she got to talk to her over the last couple of weeks? Surely this was some kind of joke. After a moment, when no one started laughing, Scylla spoke. "Porter handles my security." She gestures vaguely towards a tall blonde man sitting a few feet away on a stool at the bar. Hearing the sound of his name, he stood up and made his way to the brunette's side. Rael shifted uncomfortably and Isadora frowned, eyes looking around the room for help. It came in the form of a very gay man dressed in tight black jeans and a black t-shirt with a plum-colored blazer who approached him and slung an arm around the brunette's shoulder. "Syl, hun, We talked about this. Now that you're winning all these awards, you need more people to help you keep you safe. A professional bodyguard, Isadora added. Miss Collar, this is Byron, Scylla's brother. Raelle smiled at the tall and lanky man. Scylla mused, her eyes still on Raelle. You don't look like a bodyguard. What did you expect? Raelle asked, starting to get annoyed with the brunette's flippant attitude. Scylla ducked away from her brother and shrugged. She placed a hand on Porter's muscular arm and gave it a playful squeeze. I don't know, someone bigger, maybe taller, someone tough. Porter cackled and preened at Scylla's attention. He jutted his chin out, challenging Raelle. Raelle had to resist, rolling her eyes at Scylla's security. He was large, loud, and looked like he'd been pulled straight off of some football field, where he'd bulldoze people until he'd hit his head one too many times and had to be benched. She didn't like his attitude, and she didn't like the way Scylla was handling what was supposed to be a serious meeting. They never see me coming, beautiful, Raelle shot back, goading Porter and meeting Scylla's mischievous gaze with a cocky grin. Southern charm and professionalism be damned. She wasn't about to back down from a challenge. Scylla's eyes widened and her mouth formed a small O before she smiled at Isadora. Well, she's right about that. Scylla could see that the blonde might be uncomfortable, but Raelle was still holding her own in the chaotic, unfamiliar space around her. Her ears had picked up the melodious hint of a southern accent in the blonde's voice. She took note of her well-defined arms, visible even under Raelle's blazer. Scylla's eyes flickered back to her face, and she noticed a scar that ran from her cheek to her chin on one side. She wondered if the blonde had got it while she was in the military. Scylla didn't like that she wanted to know more about this woman. It seemed that Isadora had deliberately searched out and found a security expert that just happened to be Scylla's type. No doubt to lure her into agreeing to this ridiculous bodyguard idea. Well, at least if she hired her, she'd have someone worth looking at around the house. Scylla made her decision and offered Raelle an almost shy smile. It's very nice to meet you, Raelle, Scylla said, sauntering up to the blonde and offering her hand. Raelle found herself returning the brunette's smile, with one of her own in spite of herself. She liked the way her name sounded on a musician's lips. She took the offered hand and was surprised at Scylla's firm grip. Scylla held the blonde's hand for a moment longer than necessary, her fingers brushing the inside of Raelle's wrist before dropping it with a smirk. Can I offer you a drink? No, thank you, Raelle answered. The touch had surprised her and left her a bit dazed. She felt her pulse quicken. She cleared her throat to center herself. Scylla grinned at Raelle's obvious distracted state. Well, welcome to my little crew. She said the last part in air quotes, laughing, and took a step back out of the blonde's personal space. At least that's what Isadora calls it. Grateful for the space and moment to find her voice, Raelle spoke again, determined to focus on her job and not the sexy woman before her. Scylla Ramshorn couldn't be a woman to Raelle, not now that she had become her client. Let's talk about the security concerns Raelle was interrupted by a loud whoop. She glanced around, the source coming from a man occupying the other leather chair near the stage. He shouted out another cheer and jumped up, waving his phone over his head as he bounded up to Scylla. His black locks of hair were held in place with enough gel to keep them secure until the rapture, and the scent of his cologne made Raelle take a step back to keep from sneezing in his face. We got it, he said, ignoring Raelle and stepping into the space she'd occupied only a moment before. What? Scylla asked him, her tone expectant. Mojo, he answered. Scylla sounded a loud ha, and he picked up the brunette and swung her around in a tight circle. Scylla's attention was immediately diverted as soon as he'd put her down and handed her his phone. She read what was on the screen and grinned. I told you I'd get it. Scylla and the man talked, laughing and bouncing up and down on the balls of their feet. After a moment, the man turned to walk back toward his seat, and Scylla went with him. The meeting with Raelle completely forgotten. Porter quickly followed him. Raelle's mouth gaped open, and she looked at Isadora. The manager shrugged, apologetic. That was Scylla's publicist, Garrett Buttonwood, Isadora explained. What the hell is Mojo? Raelle asked. In the absence of his sibling, Byron answered. A magazine. They're going to do a photo spread of Scylla. It's kind of a big deal, Byron smiled at her. "And so are you. We're really happy to have you here. We'll address any concerns that you have." "Thank you," Rael managed to answer. "But I really should be talking to Miss Ramshorn about all this." Scylla continued her conversation with Garrett and Porter, ignoring the blonde's presence, and Byron eventually had to call out for his sister to get her attention. The brunette turned and looked at Rael and her brother. Her eyes met Rael's again, and she shrugged. "This is all Isadora and Byron's idea. They suddenly have an obsession with me needing more security. They are the ones you should be talking to." Rael clenched her jaw, the reason for the musician's flippant attitude suddenly dawning on her. "Syl," Byron whined, "you promised you'd cooperate." "And I am," Scylla huffed. "I said I'd hire her, and I just did. I just don't see the point in knowing all about security measures." "Right," Garrett agreed, looking at Rael for the first time. "I'm sure you can install whatever kind of security upgrades to the property that you want. But Scylla is a busy woman. You can't just constantly follow her around and ask her questions all the time." "Garrett," Isadora snapped, her voice a warning. "Really, I don't need her help," Porter whispered to Scylla, jerking a thumb towards Rael. Rael listened, her temper flaring as Isadora and Byron squared off with Porter and Garrett about the merits of professional security. Scylla just stood in the middle, following the conversation back and forth with her eyes, a grin on her face, apparently amused by their infighting and at her being the cause of it. Rael could tell that this was a common occurrence. After a moment, Scylla caught Rael's gaze and winked. "See what I have to deal with here?" "Miss Ramshorn," Rael began. "Scylla," the brunette corrected. "Miss Ramshorn," Rael repeated, her voice thick with anger. "I think that there has been a mistake." "A mistake?" Scylla parroted. "Yes. I'm afraid there's been some sort of misunderstanding about what I'm here to do. If you'll point me to the quickest way out, I'll get out of your hair." Scylla's eyes widened at the sudden turn of events. No one had ever refused a position with her. Before she could speak, Byron and Isadora stopped their arguing with Garrett and stared at the blonde. Porter looked at Rael. His bright blue eyes shone with triumph. He stretched out an arm, pointing at a set of French doors on the far end of the dance floor. "You can go out that way by the gardens." Rael offered Scylla a curt nod and stepped around her, following Porter's directions. Isadora yelled after Rael as she opened one of the doors, but the blonde ignored her and stormed out into the sunshine. Scylla's eyes never left the form of the blonde as she marched out of the field of vision. She had her full attention now, though admittedly it was too late. Rael Collar was certainly full of storm and fury. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own, and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.